Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, Jon Schwabish. I'm very excited for this week's episode because we spent a lot of time on this show talking about quantitative data collection, analysis, and data visualization. But there's a whole other world of qualitative data, both in how it's collected, how it's analyzed, and how it's communicated or visualized to your reader, your user, your audience member. And so on this week's episode of the show, I'm really fortunate to have Jessica Calarco join me on the show. She's the author of the new book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. And you're going to hear in this interview, we're going to spend, obviously, a bit of time talking about her book. So the content of the book and how women did become America's safety net and what that means. And so we're going to spend the first 10 or so minutes of the interview talking about the actual content of the book. But then we turn to where I think many listeners of this podcast are probably interested in, which is how do you go about doing qualitative research, qualitative data work? How do you go about collecting that information? How do you go about analyzing transcripts? I mean, hundreds of transcripts, hundreds of interviews that Jessica and her team have conducted over the last 3.5, 4 years. How do you go about disseminating that information? How do you go about weaving it together with text in your book or your report or your brief or your blog post? And then we talk a little bit about, qualitative data visualization. And we talk about ways in which she has worked with others, with her graduate students, with other colleagues, to actually visualize and communicate qualitative data. So if you are thinking about learning more about qualitative data work and analysis, I think this conversation could be one of your starting places because Jessica is going to share a bunch of resources. Of course, I have them linked in the show notes, but she's going to share a bunch of resources and strategies and techniques that she and her team use to collect this qualitative data. And then she's going to talk about her methods of actually going through all of these transcripts to build out these stories and then how she goes about weaving them together, in this case, weaving them together into her book. So I think you're really going to enjoy this episode if you are thinking about broadening your horizons into more qualitative data. So here's my conversation with University of Wisconsin-Madison sociologist and author of the new book, Holding It Together, Jessica Calarco. Hi, Jessica. Great to meet you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to meet you, too.
I mean, I'm very excited to chat with you. First off, UW-Madison, so I'm an alum, so just got that, instant friendship, because Badgers.
Absolutely.
And then your new book, Holding It Together, which I have right here. I also have the ebook version, too, which I started reading, and then I was like, it's really hard to, dog-ear things and, write, even though the digital thing doesn't work for me. So I like the paper one. So so this was really fun. And then your book on qualitative methods was really great. So I'm excited to talk with you all things qualitative. So maybe we could start with introductions, your background a little bit, and then we can talk about the book.
Sure.
Great.
So I'm a sociologist at the UW-Madison. Mostly I focus on inequalities in family life and education, with a particular emphasis on qualitative methods. And in terms of ethnographic work with some of my earlier research, mostly on families and schools, and more interview-based research with some of my newer projects, like with this new book.
That's great. So I do want to talk about methods, but I also want you to talk about the book itself. So the message of the book. So, So why don't you give folks what are they going to learn when they read this?
Yeah. So essentially, the core argument here is that other countries have invested in social safety nets to protect people from falling into poverty, to give them a leg up in reaching opportunities, and to make sure that people have the time and energy to contribute to a shared project of care. Whereas in the US, billionaires and big corporations and their friends have decided that they don't want to pay for those kinds of social safety net programs. And so they've turned us into what I call a DIY society instead. And the idea here is that people should be able to manage their own risks and responsibilities, take care of themselves essentially without support from the government. And the idea is that if they just make the right choices, if they just, take the right steps, follow the right plan, they shouldn't need that kind of government support. But the reality is that we actually can't DIY society. Certainly, I think this breaks down most readily around caregiving, in the sense that some people, children, elderly people, people who are sick or disabled, often can't take care of themselves, at least fully. And also, some jobs don't pay enough to actually allow people to support themselves on their own. And so acknowledging those kinds of policy failures would destroy this illusion of a DIY society. But the US is able to maintain that illusion by essentially relying on women to be this invisible glue that fills in the gaps in our economy and the gaps in our social safety net. So, for example, women do almost 70% of the lowest wage jobs in the US economy. And those are disproportionately jobs in the caregiving sector, things like home health care and childcare. And on top of that unpaid labor, women in the US are also doing almost twice as much, on top of that underpaid labor, women are also doing almost twice as much unpaid labor as men are. And that work is really crushing women, particularly women from systematically and multiply marginalized groups who often have nowhere to turn for support in managing the kinds of challenges that they've been handed, and nowhere to hide when others, see them finding ways to make it work and then asking them to do even more. And yet I argue in the second half of the book that, we know what the problems are. We know this is crushing us and leaving us oftentimes worse off than our counterparts in other high income countries. But we haven't fixed these problems, in part because the same billionaires and big corporations who brought us this DIY society have also sold us a set of myths that are aimed at deluding us into believing that we don't need a social safety net, and also at dividing us by race and class and gender and politics in ways that keep us from coming together across those differences to really demand the net that we all really desperately need.
And do you dive in, what are your policy, I don't want to say recommendations, but what are your policy prescriptions to building out, and I'm not going to say building out the middle class, because it's really not the middle class that you're focused on. It's really kind of probably at this point, 92% of the income distribution. But what are some of your policy prescriptions that you think would resolve some of the challenges you just mentioned?
And I tend to think about it in sort of three big buckets, in the sense that we need policies first that allow all people to live with dignity. And I think this will get us to kind of some of where we're going later on in the conversation around empathy. But I think we have this safety net right now that is built on the notion that you have to prove that you are deserving of support, either by being so destitute that you just can't possibly take care of yourself. And if you are in that boat, there's a lot of stigma and shame that comes with needing support, or by, showing that you have worked really hard and so you deserve things like tax credits on your on your home mortgages, things like that.
Right.
And so that notion of deservingness, if we flip the script and say, no, there are things that we all just basically need as human beings to have a life with dignity, things like affordable housing, things like sufficient healthy food, things like clean water, things like access to education, that really should just be basic access for everyone to be able to live a life with dignity. So I think that's one big bucket. Another key piece here is about making sure that people have access to opportunities. And this can mean things like support with caregiving, childcare for families so that they do have the opportunity to engage in paid work, things like free college to make sure that people have access to those kinds of opportunities that can, give them access to different types of jobs in our society, things along those lines. And then the third bucket is really about making sure that people have the time and energy and incentive to contribute to this shared project of care. And this is where things like, not only paid family leave, having time to, take off to care for your families, your loved ones, but also things like limits on paid work hours, things like the 4-day work week or 35-hour work week limits that we've seen in other countries be very effective in kind of limiting the extent to which our paid jobs can take over our lives, and meaning that there's less pressure to invest more time in paid work simply to be able to have the money that you need to have that level of security, because you know that you have your basis taken care of instead.
Do you think this is the policy challenges are primarily at the federal level, or are a lot of these, or at least some of these, at the local or the state level?
I mean, certainly, I think we've seen some states make inroads in terms of putting in place policies like, affordable childcare, things like
Right.
universal pre-K, things like even guaranteed paid family leave. And so I think, if anything, what we've seen is that this is possible to do at the state level, but it also drives larger inequalities, in the sense that the states that are putting in place these protections are often also the states where other protections exist around, say, reproductive freedom. And I talk in the book about how attacks on reproductive reproductive freedom, whether through policy or through culture, operate to trap women in these kinds of systems of exploitation, make it easier for them to be pushed into precarious situations, which can lead them to getting pulled into low-wage jobs, oftentimes low-wage caregiving jobs. And so I think what we've seen is that the lack of response at the federal level has left it to the states in ways that drive huge inequalities between women in different states in terms of both the precarity that they face in terms of reproductive freedom and also the kinds of the lack of support that they get on the policy side as well.
Right. I'm guessing that. Well, I wonder if you get pushback on the focus on women in this book, and whether people are like, well, what about men? And so, like, if like, so what is? Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned a lot of different factors that disproportionately affect women, and you talk about it in the book, but particularly women of color. But like, what is your response to that when someone says, well, what about men?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's a couple things going on here. And first, it's about recognizing who is kind of disproportionately carrying the burden. And this has to do with the fact that in this DIY society model, everyone who has a little bit of privilege has an interest in helping themselves get further ahead by pushing any sort of risk and responsibility they face further downstream. And so often that means men pushing risk and responsibility onto the women around them, their wives, their mothers, their girlfriends, their daughters, even in some cases. And then for those women, the choice is then between, do I carry that responsibility myself, or do I have enough privilege to then push some of that risk and responsibility, some of that caregiving responsibility, for example, onto other women who are in more vulnerable positions than my own? And that's part of how we get to a situation where for, relatively affluent white women, that the choice is between, it's sort of a moral dilemma in the sense of, do I do this responsibility? Do I do this work myself? Or do I push this onto another woman, oftentimes a woman of color, a low-income woman who is struggling to make ends meet, but whose underpaid work allows me to, keep my job and compete with men in the workforce. And so it's sort of this trickle down effect of the way that we pass the buck care wise and risk wise in this kind of a DIY model. And so that's why I think the focus is on women, in part because it allows us to see these dynamics in terms of both what privilege can buy you in terms of outsourcing care, and also what happens when you are in those multiply marginalized positions where you often have no choice but to do the unpaid caregiving work for your family and the underpaid work that makes paid work possible for others in your community as well.
Right. So we've been talking about 10 minutes on the content of the book, and probably most people who listen to this podcast are like, this isn't about data. Why am I listening to this? So let's talk about the data part. A lot of the folks that I talk to on this show are doing quantitative data work, but qualitative data is its own skill set, its own challenges, both visually and also just going through the data. And I want to start with what you mentioned earlier on this concept of empathy. There are two quotes. I'm going to read them because there are two quotes in the book that really I double underlined. There's one where you say, if you believe that some people are simply lazy, that they will mooch off others without giving back what they can, then it's easy to oppose a more universal safety net, which you've already mentioned today. And the other one, an absence of empathy also pushes us toward a more punitive social safety net, one that disciplines people for needing government support. And you've already talked about the lack of empathy in this DIY society and in our policies. But can you talk a little bit about, I guess it's sort of a two-part question, how the data that sort of you use for the book and how empathy comes into play when you're doing your interviews, when you're doing your focus groups?
Yeah, so the data for the book come primarily from about 400 hours of interviews that my team and I conducted with families that we've been following, families with young children that we started following back in 2018 when the woman and the partner, they were all women who identified for the study, when the woman partner was pregnant. And so we started following them, asking them a whole extensive survey about their kind of parenting decisions that they planned to make, and then followed those same women over time, checking in with them at 6 months and 12 months and 18 months postpartum. And then we also did 3 waves of pandemic-focused data collection with the moms and with their partners, because we were still in the field when the pandemic hit, and it just became so apparent so quickly through the follow-up interviews that we did, how much of an impact this was having on families with young kids. And so we started by recruiting these moms in prenatal clinics, mostly in Indiana, and then followed them over time, though some of them spread out over the course of the project with 250 families that we started with. And then during the pandemic, in part because we wanted to see how is this, very particular qualitative sample mapping onto larger patterns, I also fielded two national surveys, each with about 2,000 parents from across the US, one through Ipsos and one through Qualtrics, to kind of just get a sense of how the patterns were playing out on a larger scale, and kind of use in the book a mix of the two types of data.
Right.
In terms of the qualitative data, I mean, this to me, one of the strengths I see in qualitative data is the idea that you can elicit empathy in yourself as the researcher and in your reader. And I talk about this in qualitative literacy in my book with Mario Small, that it's cognitive empathy, and cognitive empathy is different than you can't totally empathize with someone, oftentimes because their circumstances are very different from your own. But it's a way of being able to understand someone's life in the way that they understand it themselves, to achieve that sense of kind of appreciation for the
Mm-hmm.
context of their lives, the decisions that they're making, and to do so in a way that at least acknowledges their perceptions, their meanings, their realities as they perceive them. And so I think there's value in qualitative data, particularly in that it resonates with people differently than quantitative data. That when you hear a story that does echo your own life, that's powerful in a way that simply seeing a data point that matches your beliefs, doesn't quite ring that same way. And similarly, hearing the story of someone whose life might be very different from your own, but seeing it presented in a way that offers a window into that experience and treats that person's life, as not as an oddity to be sort of explored, but instead
Right.
as sort of a rich and meaningful experience grounded grounded in the contexts in which they live and the messages in which they've been exposed to. That kind of a portrait can help to inspire that cognitive empathy for readers as well. And that's really my hope with the book, is that this resonates with readers on a personal level and also helps them to feel a stronger sense of empathy toward people whom they might otherwise disagree with or be critical of in their larger lives.
Right. So I think one of the critiques, I would say unfair critiques that people have of qualitative work is like, oh, you've only talked to, a small number of, it's not, statistically representative. So how, like when you think about, and what you do actually, I think uniquely well in this book, I should note, is combine the quantitative data with the qualitative data, which I think is kind of the most powerful way to sort of tell those stories. But when you hear people say that, oh, it's not a representative sample. You've spoken to 200 families, 200 moms, 100 blah blah blah. Like, how do you think about countering that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I typically argue in that sense is that the value of qualitative data is not in telling you how common some pattern is, but in helping to explain where patterns come from. It helps to reveal mechanisms, to be able to trace processes, to link ideas together in ways that simply just that large scale quantitative data are often not well equipped to do, especially if we're talking about panel data where you can look at associations, but you can't necessarily say what the causal impact is of one factor on another. Whereas if you are actually talking to people, if you're asking them questions, and especially if you're following them over time and seeing how things play out, that's a way to actually be able to understand what is driving this particular decision that they're making, or what is
Mm-hmm.
how is their life playing out in these particular ways. And you can start to see those causal processes, those causal mechanisms, in a way that quantitative data, especially kind of panel survey type data, often isn't similarly equipped to do. And it can also through the kind of careful analysis of qualitative data, looking at the use of the way people use language, the way people kind of, even contradict themselves at times, can reveal larger cultural structures. The way people think is often shaped by the kinds of ideas that we're exposed to. And we can see echoes of that in the way that people talk about themselves and narrate their lives, and starting to see the justifications that people use and how those kind of map onto larger, I do some qualitative content analysis in the book too, in terms of bringing
Mm-hmm.
in analyses of things like parenting books, like kind of secular and religious parenting books, and the
Right.
kinds of messages that these are teaching. And when you can literally see echoes of the kinds of messages in these books in the way that parents are talking about raising their children, you can start to see the emphasis of these kinds of media-based messages, these kinds of cultural ideas on the way that people understand and make decisions in their own lives.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your best practices. I use that term loosely, but best practices when it comes to conducting interviews. Like, I think there are a lot of people who have I mean, well, I'll just say for myself, like I went through grad school as an economist, zero qualitative methods training, right? Like had to pick that up as I'm doing it at the Urban Institute, right? Doing interviews, sort of learning from my colleagues who do this day in and day out, and sort of picking out what are the best practices. But for you, when you are talking to these families, when you're talking to these moms, what are some of the things that you are, always trying to do? What are some of the ways that you're able to elicit these stories? Like, what are those best practices for you and your team?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did with this project that I'm very grateful that we did in hindsight, in part because I was doing the interviews with a team of graduate students and with varied levels of experience with collecting qualitative data, was that we always did surveys before each wave of interviews. And those surveys
Mm.
included fairly detailed background questions, as well as questions about the circumstances of mothers' lives and their partners' lives. And what that allowed me to do was set up essentially a flagging system where we knew which mothers were facing the most difficult circumstances, the ones who had, whether that was economic hardship or difficult partner relationships or physical trauma after birth, for example. And what we did was we sort of triaged who was going to do each interview based on, the level of difficulty that interview was going to likely, involve. And so
Mm.
I would do the kind of the most sensitive ones, or I had a handful of other, team members who had a lot of experience in the field. Do those, whereas graduate students who are relatively new to interviewing tended to do the interviews that were, we expected would be relatively light in terms of content in those kinds
Right.
of ways. And so that for
Right.
me was huge in terms of, I mean, these were interviews that had a lot of trauma. And a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty. And so making sure that I was taking care of my team, in addition to putting people in place that were highly experienced to handle those more sensitive interviews, was really important, in part because there's a risk when you're conducting interviews with people about sensitive parts of their lives. New interviewers often shy away from hard things, whether that's negative emotions, if someone breaks down in tears, if someone, starts to kind of sound like they're tearing up. It's very easy for new interviewers to just kind of quickly jump to the next question. But that actually risks signaling to the person that you're interviewing that their emotions are too much for you as the
Mm.
researcher. And so they will start to feel guilty, start to feel bad, or can start to feel bad about, the negative emotions that they're feeling in the moment. And so being willing to kind of sit with someone in those hard moments, the way that you would with a close friend or family member, getting comfortable with the the negative parts, and also learning tools to probe gently around those kinds of difficult experiences, while also finding ways later on in the interview to circle back to more hopeful things, to give people a chance to feel more empowered, to feel a stronger sense of agency. So like I always like to end my interviews on thinking about, hopes for the future or advice that people would give to others, something that, especially if we've hit on a lot of difficult content, can give them a chance to just feel a little better as we end things, as opposed to kind of leaving things on a really difficult or dark note.
Yeah.
And similarly, in terms of, the actual interviews themselves, I think another key thing here is a willingness and an ability to follow up effectively in interviews. That this is one of the keys, in my view, to achieving cognitive empathy, is the ability to notice when people are sort of leaving you breadcrumbs, and kind of people will often, we do this in conversation. We drop hints at things where we're like, I'm not sure if you want to go there, but like, this is something I'm thinking of,
Yeah.
like this is what's
Yeah.
going on in the back of my mind. And when we notice those things, it actually signals to our participants that we're hearing them, that we're listening carefully, and that we're willing to kind of follow that lead in ways that kind of sticking to a carefully prescribed interview script just signals that really we just care about getting the questions answered, and not that we
Right.
really care about understanding their lives, in the full context, in the full context of their experiences. And so I think that's another place where learning to probe effectively, kind of following those breadcrumbs, noticing things where people have kind of mentioned things that seem unrelated, but oftentimes are alluding to bigger parts of their lives that are maybe deeply significant. I interviewed this one mom who kept mentioning kind of the time in her life when her and her husband first got together. And so eventually I stopped and said, hey, can you tell me about how you and your husband first got together? And it turned out that he was actually married to someone else at the time, and that they had an affair, and that
Mm.
and then he ended up breaking up with his previous wife, and this caused all kinds of chaos and turmoil. And so
Right.
kind of being willing to kind of follow that lead and talk to her and ask her questions about that thing that kind of kept coming up, was a way into understanding much better the kind of context and contours of her current life and circumstances as well.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about that, because it's like it's partly psychology, right? Like the way you've described some of this, but it's also interesting. So to follow these threads, you I'm guessing have a script, had a set of questions that you come in with. Do you find that you sacrifice some of those questions further down on your sheet when you follow some of these threads, and you're okay with that because you end up in you don't have then the same set of answers from every person you've interviewed, but you're maybe enriching the data in different ways?
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think certainly there's differences of opinion among qualitative researchers about how closely you should stick to the script. I
Yeah.
typically tend to have, a handful of questions where these are the core topics that I want to make sure that I cover. And then I'll have other things that if I have time, I want to get to as well. And so I'll try to make sure that I'm at least getting at those core ideas. But other than that, I tend to let things go pretty freely, in part because I also know that, with most of the studies that I'm doing, I'll have a chance to come back to these and talk to these people again. And so if
Right.
there's things that I don't get to, that's part of the beauty of longitudinal interviewing too, is that
Yeah.
you can, fill in those gaps later if there are things that you don't ask. But I think there's also value in giving people a chance to tell their story in a holistic way, in a sense that it leads oftentimes to what Mario and I talk about as more palpable answers
Hmm.
that aren't simply generalizations. Essentially what we're doing as the qualitative data analysts is generalizing from people's experiences about, larger phenomena in the world. And if our questions ask people to generalize about their own lives, then essentially we're making generalizations of generalizations, and we don't
Right.
necessarily get to we don't see how people came to those generalizations, which is really the beauty of qualitative data, and that you can say, okay, give me an actual example of that, or tell me how that works in practice, in ways that, or with ethnography, seeing how that actually plays out in practice in ways that can help you to see not only how people generalize about their own lives, but also in terms of the generalizations that we make, ground those as closely as possible in lived realities.
Yeah. Uh, I have several questions for you, but I wanted to ask because you're dealing with difficult questions, difficult circumstances, maybe trauma. What are the steps that you take for yourself and for your team? Like, coming out of some of these interviews that I'm sure are difficult for the interviewer as well as the interviewee.
Yeah, there's a terrific book chapter by sociologist Lacey Abrego about what she calls accompaniment. And I have my students read that, in the qualitative methods courses that I teach, and I have my students read it when they're working on an interview team with me, because it offers an important window into the kinds of negative emotions that come up when you're dealing with trauma or difficult subjects, both for the interview participant and for the interviewer. And it talks about kind of the ways that you can help take care of your participants in interviews, but also, having someone to debrief with after
Yeah.
interview, after conducting a difficult interview, having someone, even if there's some qualitative scholars who recommend like wearing different clothes to do interviews than you would in your kind of day-to-day lives, because you can
Mm.
take those clothes off at the end of the interview, in a way that can kind of put some mental distance between,
Right.
the work that you're doing as an interviewer and, the mental work of the rest of your life. And so I think there's tools that we can use. I think there's a number of tools that we can use, whether oftentimes psychological, to help ourselves
Right.
navigate through those difficult moments. And definitely, having people to debrief with, I think, is one of the most important ones. And even
Yeah.
just spending time memoing and reflecting too on difficult things that interviews might bring up for you, in your own life in the process of conducting them too.
Right. Right. Okay. So, you have identified your interviewees in this book. It sounded like it was starting at prenatal clinics and following folks through. You've done your interviews, and so what's your process about navigating your way through all of that interview text? Because I think this is the thing that people get overwhelmed about, especially who are not trained in these methods. Are like, I've got even just 1 hour. I've got 1 hour of transcript. How do I pull anything out of this? So, like, what are your methods for that?
Yeah, there's a couple different strategies, especially with this much data. It can be really hard
Yeah.
to wrap your head around. And so one of the things that we did, with the interviews was we had, interviewers actually fill out a post-interviewer survey, where they
Mm.
identified the key themes in the interview, identified key quotes that might have, or key ideas that might have illustrated those themes, pointed to things that, like, what were the questions that we didn't ask, what were the things that, what are the things we should follow up on. And so those survey responses for me, then can create a table out of those and kind of look through them and identify, okay, what are the major themes? Or I can help to sort people into different categories and say, this person kind of falls in this bucket, this person kind of falls in that bucket. And so, that's another place where both the post-interview survey data and the pre-interview survey data become really important for helping to sort of start to categorize people in terms of their experiences. And then once I have a sort of sense of like, who are the, white evangelical Christian moms, for example, or who are the moms who are stay-at-home moms versus the ones working for pay full-time. Once I can sort them into buckets, then depending on what I'm trying to do analysis-wise, I can sort the interviews and then read them in groups, essentially, and look for, there's a terrific book by Stefan Timmermans and Ido Tavori about, they have a couple of books on abductive analysis, and their most recent one is a book about how to do abductive analysis. And one of the things that they recommend that is a practice very similar to what I use in my own research is essentially reading the data, especially kind of clustered sets of data, to identify things that are surprising or interesting in light of what we already know, and identifying index cases of those kind of surprising or interesting things, and then comparing the rest of the data, say like maybe there's a particularly interesting case of a stay-at-home mom. I'm going to kind of keep that case open on one side of my desktop, and I'm going to compare it to all the other stay-at-home moms and say, like, is she illustrative of a larger pattern, or is she more of an outlier? And start to kind of create data matrices where I'm tracking what are these patterns, what's interesting here, and then writing memos that unpack, what might be explaining this, what are the next things to unpack here. I very rarely jump in with a data set like this and just start sort of open coding. It's too big, and it tends to get, too overwhelming way too quickly. Instead, if I use coding, it much more tends to be toward the end of a process where I've used memoing, used this kind of index casing to identify what I think is going on, having a theory of kind of, this is what I think makes sense of this particular type of experience. And then I'll go through systematically and say, does the data fit the theory or not? Does each mother kind of, or each partner, follow this pattern or not? Where are the outliers? What might explain those outliers? And so it's a more strategic use of coding as opposed to trying to jump in from the beginning with coding, and doing a lot more sort of memoing and theorizing, especially with, the volume of data. I also do a lot of kind of treating these interviews almost like life histories, because we do follow them over time, and writing memos where I sort of synthesize and summarize, let's look at this mother's experience over time. How would I tell her story in a fairly condensed way? And then using those sometimes to analyze instead of looking at the full set of transcripts too.
Right. And then when it comes to your process of writing, in particular this book, because what you don't do in the book is sort of like start with, you do start in the introduction with sort of an illustrative story, but like it's not like every chapter starts with a story and then you go into your analysis, right? It's like it's all kind of interwoven together, which is why it's such a good read. So how do you think about your writing? Do you get to a point where you're like, I need a story here? Or are you like, what's that process like for you?
Yeah, and this was a book that I wrote in many, many drafts, and so I think this was something that it didn't come out onto the page this way, as very rarely does anything ever come out exactly the way that it gets published. But this was a place where I think I did an early draft of the book, like a full draft of the book that I shared with a group of trusted sociologist friends who came out for a book workshop, and so and they helped me sort of rework, these are the core ideas that belong in the book, and here's where you could maybe reorganize some things to kind of interweave things better, or change around the chapter orders. And so this is another place where I think relying on trusted people to look at our work and help us see where might an example illustrate this better, how might you bring in some stories. At the same time, I think this is also a practice that I've honed a little bit through some op-ed writing and more public style writing, because it is sort of it's closer to that model than a typical academic kind of model, where you're often maybe you lead with an example, then you go into some data, some like quantitative data, then maybe you bring in a personal anecdote. There's sort of ways to weave back and forth, and so I think practicing styles of writing other than just traditional academic stuff is useful for me too.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think there's any. I'm flipping through it. I don't think there's any data viz in the book. There's a lot of data in the book, quantitative and qualitative. But you've published a lot. So I wanted to ask about qualitative data viz in the work that you've done, where you have actually like data viz. Now, aside from word clouds, because we're going to avoid word clouds on the show, but like, what are some of your approaches to trying to create visualizations out of all this qualitative data that you have?
Yeah, so I have a paper that I published with one of my graduate students, Monica Heilman, that is published in visual studies. She's a trained visual artist. And so we worked with the pandemic data in particular, especially the early waves of the pandemic data. I've never had a response like that. We did 65 interviews in 4 weeks. Like basically, it was just a bonkers level of data collection.
Yeah.
But I think there were a lot of moms who felt very isolated and overwhelmed in those early. This was April and May of 2020, and just kind of feeling completely overwhelmed by pandemic parenting. And so one of the things that Monica and I did with those data was to synthesize and summarize, what are the key themes, the key challenges that mothers are facing? And then she created visual representations, illustrations, pen and ink illustrations of those kinds of challenges. Things like, the feeling of sort of identity loss around, not being able to connect to paid work, the feeling of sort of claustrophobia around being at home with your partner and your kids and trying to do paid work at the same time, the sense of loss of community that came from COVID restrictions. And so we illustrated those, and we kind of worked back and forth on drafts of them. And then she kind of penned the final versions that went into the piece. And for us, that was, and we've shared that with a number of people, and they found it a sort of really powerful representation of the kinds of challenges that mothers in particular were facing during those early pandemic weeks and months. And so I think that was, one of the ways that we tried to visually capture these kinds of data. And certainly you can't capture everyone's experience, but having a sort of collection of images that tried to capture sort of what were the varied types of challenges that mothers were facing during this time was one of the things we tried to do there. And then other ways, I think the other place where thinking about visual representation comes up for me is often in presenting data, and in the sense that, if I'm standing up in front of an audience or talking about my book, I could put quotes up on the slide, but I don't like to do that because I feel like the audience is going to read those quotes faster than I can read them aloud. And it also, I think, takes away from my ability to almost perform the quotes with emphasis, with meaning, with kind of the way that you would kind of act them out. And so I think saving the quotes and putting up, illustrative images, of people who maybe it's, typically it's not the people who are actual participants, but finding images that either represent aspects of what they're saying, graphic type, icon type images, or it's things like, sometimes photos of people that represent aspects of their lives or aspects of their identities that can give people a sense of the person behind the quote, or a sense of the experience behind it, even if they're not from the actual data itself.
Yeah, I wonder about that because I've suggested this to folks, and a lot of, I don't know, many folks who do qualitative work, they hesitate on that part because, like you said, you don't usually have pictures of the people you've interviewed. But if you're doing a study on, whatever it is, some behavior amongst some group, and you get a picture of people who look like that group from, Unsplash or from iStock or Getty, and you put it up. I think some people hesitate to put up an image that's not from that specific person. And I wonder, I have my own view on that, but I want to get your take on
Yeah,
that
I think it's
balance.
certainly, an imperfect science in that sense, and there are certainly hesitations. I typically do add a disclaimer at the bottom of slides that says like these pictures do not represent the actual
Yeah.
people that were participants in the interviews. I think at the same time, I'm hesitant to use photography in my own work, even if some IRBs would allow that. In part because I'm often doing work with families, and so even if mom and dad consent to be part of the interview, is it
Kids.
okay if kids, would they want? And so I think it's just too easy to link people together in ways that I tend to err on the side of, not disclosing in those kinds of ways. And so because of that, at the same time, I think there is something about seeing images of people that can help us to kind of get into that empathy mindset, or put our
Yeah.
listeners or our readers into that empathy mindset in a way that might not be possible without that kind of imagery in the background. And so I think certainly you can do things with icon type imagery that illustrates ideas, but oftentimes people, especially people expressing types of emotion. And so I'll often use them in that way. If I can find a picture of someone who kind of like illustrates the kind of frustration or the kind of elation or the kind of sadness that someone's experiencing, that those kinds of emotionally evocative images are the ones that I tend to gravitate toward, as helping to show the feeling behind the quote as well.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. So, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. Love the book. if folks have questions for you, they want to invite you to talk, they want to invite you to come give a full day qualitative methods training because you don't have anything else going on, right, with research and students, where should folks reach out to you to find you?
Sure. So you can find me on my website at jessicacalarco.com.
Great. Okay. So folks should check it out. Should definitely check out the book, Holding It Together by Jessica Calarco. Jessica, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. And good luck with the rest of the, with what I'm sure is a long book tour across many universities. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you will check out Jessica's new book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. And I also hope that you will take just a moment out of your day to rate or review this show wherever you listen to your podcasts, be it Spotify, iTunes, on my website, on YouTube, wherever you get it. I hope you'll just take a moment. Really does help me expand the reach of the audience, which in turn helps me find more and more guests to bring you great content to help you be a more effective data communicator. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.